You're listening to Lemon's Listening Library. Discover the story behind the stories with unique and raw conversations from the people who make your favorite books a reality. All right, everybody, welcome back to Lemon's Listening Library. We are the platform and the podcast where we share the story behind the stories. I'm your host, Randy Lemons, fantasy author, and some of you might know me as RL Rose if you're into the romance scene. I am joined today by my amazing co-host, Kathy. Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, sure. I'm Kathy Ireland. I am an ARC reader, an avid audiobook listener. I listen to most of my books on audio, but I do read at night too. I volunteer at some book conventions and just excited to be here.
All right, a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the episode. We have sponsorship of spots still available on our Patreon if you guys are interested in having your books or your products or your services announced and broadcast on the show or throughout our social media platforms. You can head over to our Patreon, and it's a great way to support the show while getting yourself out there as well. All right, today we're super excited. I am super excited about having this conversation with this wonderful person. And Emma, you are known as ES Luck within your realm. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I write post-apocalyptic romance as E.S. Luck, and I just released my very first book, The Wastelander, on June 30th. So it's been almost a month now that it's been out in the world. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, that is exciting. The first book is always the most, actually, I don't want to say it's always the most nerve-wracking because you can write something that's like a little bit closer to your heart later on down the line, and it's like, oh, this is just like I released my first book again, and it's the nerves all over again. But that's exciting. How do you feel coming into the book world, just having released your first book? How do you feel like with the community? And I know typically a lot of people are like a little overwhelmed by it, but how do you feel?
Mostly I feel good. Like I've been very pleasantly surprised by the amount of support that exists in the book community, especially the romance book community, I would say. Yeah, I mean, I did some research beforehand before publishing the book. I kind of hung out in some romance book spaces, and everyone there is just lovely. I was actually surprised because it's the internet, so there's definitely a lot of unpleasantness baked in there. But the romance book community, I have to say, there isn't anywhere near as much as other spaces online.
Yeah. I love, especially like you said, the romance community. They seem to be very tight knit, very like us fantasy people. We're like kind of in our own world, like, dreaming up different stories and different things. But the or the romance community, they are just like connected emotionally, I feel like.
Yeah, no, they love to discuss books and they love to share books that they love with each other. So that's that's good news for us.
Yeah. Just getting that word of mouth. You just got to make those connections, and then it's like wildfire.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Have you joined like a bunch of different, like on Facebook? I know that I'm in so many different groups.
Yes, yeah.
Like Reverse Harem group or, whatever. Yeah. That's really a great way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. So I joined a bunch of different book groups.
As you should.
Yeah, just to kind of get a feel for how people talk about books and what kind of books they talk about, and yeah, just kind of see those discussions happening in real time and just be a little bit more involved in conversing with potential readers, I guess.
Yeah,
and also
absolutely.
Just sharing my own love of books because, of course, I'm a huge reader myself and love reading. So the other great place to go for romance book discussion is the romance book subreddit on Reddit, which is incredibly active and I love the requests on that subreddit because they are so specific. But in terms of like tropes, it'll be like, help me find a book with a main male character who is in his 30s. There's an age gap. He lives in Hawaii, like just really specific requests. And I love it because inevitably someone will always come along and grant those requests and point out a book that meets most of their requirements. So I love that.
That's funny. They know what they want in their book boyfriends.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're like, I've experienced this, this, this. I don't like this, so we're gonna look for this, this, and this.
Yeah, it's crazy sometimes just seeing how specific people get. But it's fun too because it's it's amazing to see how many different books there actually are out there because inevitably someone will come along and be like, hey, this book meets most of that criteria. And it's a great way to discover new books as well because a lot of the time, because it's such a specific request, it'll be a book that you've never heard of before because it's so specific.
Right.
So yeah, it's a great way to discover new books as well.
That's not a bad idea. And like also reading that, like you don't think, at least I don't think like that when I'm consuming books of like very specific stuff. But when you read it, you're like, oh, I like that. Oh, I like that. Oh, oh my gosh, I'm going to read this book.
Yeah, the romance people have it down to a science about what they like and what they don't like. Yeah. They are not afraid of listing tropes, giving labels to tropes, and yeah, pointing
True.
out what they like. Yeah.
Very true. Yeah.
I want to commend you as an author on like the research and the effort that you put in before releasing even your first book. That is huge because a lot of, especially in the indie world, we write it and then we put it out there and we're like, oh, maybe I should have researched this or oh, what did I get myself into? And so you did a lot of the front end work before you even published your book.
Yeah, well, I think that is really important. And I mean, I'm obviously a new author, so I'm not here to like judge anyone else's process. But for me, I feel like that was a significant mistake that I saw other people making was not being aware of their audience, what their audience likes, what people are in it are reading, what they're interested in, and learning about the niche that you're writing in, whatever that may be, especially because my niche is very small. So I kind of had to make sure that, first of all, that my niche even existed, because at the beginning it was challenging because I was like, okay, I wrote this book and I'm not really sure how to categorize it, which I didn't realize was terrifying until I was done the book. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess just finding out if your niche exists, first of all, and second of all, who's reading it, like who's interested in it, and what do they like about it, and what don't they like about it?
I have a
This is
question.
definitely niche. I'm sorry, Randy.
No, you're
At the book convention that I was at the end of June, there was an author there that's what she wrote was post-apocalyptic romance because her words, she has to have shit blow up. Like that
Yeah.
was exactly what she said. Like, why does she do that? That's why.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, and this is, just for people who are interested in writing or, they're interested in the process. Did you write your book first? It sounded like you wrote your book first before you were trying to figure out what niche it fit into, right? Yeah. And that's pretty common. I'm just like, I was curious on your approach on that.
Yeah, so some people start with a plan. That was not me. I at first, when I first started writing the book, I actually didn't even know it was a book. I just started writing, and I hadn't done any creative writing in a really long time. And I started writing, and it just kind of turned into a book because I kept having ideas, I kept being inspired, I kept writing them down. And at first I was just writing it just for me, I guess, because I was like, I'm finding my enjoyment in doing this again. And I don't want to put any pressure on myself or pressure on the project because that makes it not so fun. So I am just going to dive in, see what happens. If it turns into a book, awesome. If it doesn't, that's okay. And that's what ended up happening. And I did finish it. And then I was like, oh no, it's a book now. What do I do?
Oh no, it's 100,000 words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or in my case, my first draft was like 275,000 words, which was
Nice.
way too long. So the editing process was definitely very important.
Well, so you kind of have a little bit of a an advantage in that with your background as a copywriter. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so that is definitely something that helps being an indie author, and it's part of the reason that I felt somewhat confident that I could do it on my own, rather than going the traditional publishing route and finding an agent and all that stuff. I actually looked into that quite a bit and even sent out a couple of queries, but after a couple of queries, I was like, this is not for me. Like I can't do this for, I've heard of authors going years querying. And for me, I was just like, I don't want to do that. I would rather be actually writing books and putting them out there than trying to get them published. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to do it myself. And I mean, I have a background in marketing, so I could probably do this if I just do the research and figure it out. And yeah, I think I did.
You did
So
it.
yeah, and I mean, I've also copy edited like on a professional level before, so I have that skill set where I didn't need necessarily to hire a ton of people to work on my book. I just maybe needed a couple rather than I need like a full copy edit and everything because I was able to do that myself. So lucky in that way.
Hey, that's your last name, right?
Yeah,
That's awesome. So you live in Ontario with your dog and your husband.
yeah,
Do you, yeah, yeah, yep. What got you there? Is that kind of where you grew up, or is that a
yeah.
mutual decision?
So
Yeah.
I have lived here my whole life and I grew up here. And my husband is actually from Ireland. So he moved here. And it's really interesting seeing the perspective of someone from a very different place, um, which I think is probably reflected in my writing to some extent because the two main characters are from very different worlds. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's it's interesting because I mean my husband was from a very rural area and then he came here and to me living in a fair like not a small city anymore but when I was growing up it was fairly small and then he came here and he was just like oh my god this is so different from what I'm used to and like there are buses and there's traffic and it's just different to kind of how he grew up so yeah, it's interesting to kind of see the difference and also to get to visit Ireland. That's a pretty major perk of having someone that is from there.
That's awesome. I've
Definitely on my
always wanted to
bucket
go to
list.
Ireland.
Right. I've been 6 times now, or 7 times maybe. And yeah, it's a beautiful country, beautiful place.
Amazing. What kind of dog do you have?
She is a golden retriever. See if
Oh,
I can find a decent enough picture here of her.
I love it.
Um,
I think pets are going to be like a huge thing on this show because I think
I think
everyone's
so.
mentioned pets and like they're connecting with pets. Oh,
Oh my
oh yeah.
gosh.
is she
That's
younger?
Rosie. She is 4 now, although I get asked a lot if she's a puppy because she still acts like one, very
Yeah,
much so. She
that's
always
fair.
wants to play. So,
Yeah, I've
That's
got lazy
awesome.
bones over here too.
oh,
Awesome. Well, Emma, tell us about your passion for writing and you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier that happened at a young age. Like how young and what kind of writing were you doing? Were you journaling or like how did that come about?
um, well, I guess I've always been kind of a storyteller, because even before I could write, knew how to write, I would I would walk around with toys in my hands, just kind of like narrating a little story back and forth between the two of them. And I used to always just make up little stories. I remember playing with Barbies as a kid, and my Barbies always had like so much drama going on. Just little story, just little like who divorced who was getting married to who. Yeah, stuff like that where I love to make up stories about little characters because I always used to give my Barbies characters as well. Um, so it's kind of started with that, and then once I was actually able to write, I started pretty much right away. I think the first time I remember writing anything significant, I was maybe 6 years old, and I made like a little children's book out of like construction paper, and made drawings and everything. I'm sure it was interesting, but but
Amazing.
yeah, I mean, that spark was kind of always there for me, and I always enjoyed writing, and I mean, I pursued it at the post-secondary level as well. I have a degree in English, so a lot of that degree has to do with writing and books and research and all of those things. So I did really well in school because I loved it. Yeah, so it's kind of always been there for me. Um, but I hadn't really thought about pursuing it professionally until I actually finished a book and was like, okay, now I have this book and I would maybe like people to read it, but that's always scary at first. But you know, I have this yearning to share the stories that I'm creating.
I have a question for you. You said that your Barbies had a lot of drama. As a child, did you have a lot of drama that was modeled for you? Like, was there family stuff going on? Was there situations where like, your mom watched soap operas and so you modeled that from what you perceived as a child?
Yeah, I mean, I had a tough time growing up, and I think that that definitely influenced um, those kinds of things. You know, I struggled a lot growing up with my mental health, and part of that was definitely stuff that was going on at home. And I think part of telling stories was also a way to channel those feelings that, especially as a young kid, I didn't really understand, didn't really know what they were, and didn't have a name for them. So, kind of just channeling some of that, I guess, dark energy, dark feelings into my writing. And especially when I was younger, my writing was very, it was very dark. Yeah. And some of that darkness, I think, is reflected in my first book. But I also think there's a lot more hope in it than there used to be in my writing. And I take that as a good sign.
That's funny that you mentioned the darkness, like, and I feel like a lot of kids feel ashamed for having like very dark thoughts. This is actually a conversation I had with my son. He's like, Mom, sometimes I have moments where I think about like just beating someone up or something like that. And I'm like, dude, that's okay. Like those thoughts come to you, and
Yeah.
sometimes they are just, pop-up thoughts that are random and don't really hold any meaning. And sometimes it's from an emotion, and working through that is fine. And having those thoughts is okay. Like everyone has thoughts that kind of startle them a little bit. So just letting people know that that's normal, it's helpful.
Yeah, and I think part of it as well was that, like growing up, I didn't have that kind of understanding, where someone sat me down and was like, "Hey, it's okay that you feel sad sometimes. It's okay that you're having struggles. Like that's fine." It was very much the opposite for me. It's like, "Why aren't you happy? Why aren't you happy? What's wrong with you?" Um, so because of that, I think writing became a way for me to actually express those feelings without the pressure of, okay, why aren't you happier?
That's heavy. That's heavy on kids, especially like, that immediately starts putting shame on yourself. And so you're like almost forcing yourself to go into a happier state when you have all these unresolved emotions inside you. And I think that, it's crazy how if we hold it in, we express it in other ways. And that was your writing for you.
Yeah, I think when you have those kinds of feelings, they're going to come out somehow. They have to. There's no way to there's no way to keep them secret at a certain point. It'll come out in some way. And thankfully, writing is a fairly healthy way to cope with it. I also had a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms for those feelings. But I think part of helping people deal with difficulties with their mental health, etc., is pointing to those healthier coping mechanisms. And yeah, especially creative expression, because I really feel that creative expression is healing.
Agreed.
100%, yeah. And it's funny too, like I feel like our generation and like, especially the turn of the 2000th century, a lot of people are a lot more aware of mental health and a lot more aware of like what their actions do to affect their children. But our parents, like they were doing the best they could. Like they were coming from the generation where it's like you don't talk about it, you get spanked if you do. And they're like they are trying to do better than what their parents did, but it still had such a negative, in a lot of areas, a negative impact on us because we were still so suppressed with a lot of things that like you don't talk to your parents about, you know, how you feel towards, someone you like, or just a lot of feelings you didn't get to express to them, or they said something that really hurt you. That was not your place to bring up to them. You are the child and you're going to just, what they said was what goes.
Yeah, it's a very top down sort of parenting
Yeah.
where, parents are, they're an authority figure and that's where it ends. That's it. Like they're not really there to support you emotionally. They're not really there to, um, at least for me, they're not really there to support you emotionally. They're not really going to talk to you about anything terribly serious. And you just do what you're told, and that's it.
Yeah. It's like their mindset's like, if you're not in trouble, you're not in jail, you're not, I did my job.
Yeah,
You're a working set of community. You're now into the system and that's it.
yeah.
So with you, with your depression and your, anxiety and stuff like that, you developed sort of a PTSD around that. Was that just past situations that kind of re-trigger things for you?
Yeah, so it took me a really long time to be diagnosed with PTSD because for a long time, when I went to, like, I saw tons of doctors, tons of therapists. And for a long time, I was just being told like it's depression, like you're just depressed, and you're anxious, and try this medication and let's talk in therapy about your depression. But I think over time, it became clear that something else was going on as well because my depression just wasn't getting better. Like it just wasn't getting better. Even though I tried tons of different medications, I'd been in therapy for years at a certain point, my depression wasn't improving. So I ended up going to or being sent to a specialist psychiatrist for kind of an outside opinion. And I remember her printing out a sheet of symptoms of complex PTSD. And she covered the top of it and gave me the sheet and was like, does this sound anything like what you're going through? And so I looked at the symptoms and I was like, yes, like every symptom on the list checked the box. And I was like, oh, okay. I've never heard of this diagnosis before because most people are familiar with PTSD. A lot of people are not familiar with complex PTSD. And basically, the difference is PTSD is kind of acute trauma. So it's usually a single incident. So it might be like you're in a car accident and you're traumatized by that experience and you struggle with flashbacks and everything. Complex PTSD, the difference is that it's trauma applied over time. So it's over a period of years. And there may not even be one specific incident, although there usually are standout incidents, but it's kind of just low level trauma applied for years, decades sometimes. And it affects you in a very similar way to PTSD in terms of flashbacks, um, nightmares, all that kind of classic PTSD stuff. But then you have added symptoms like identity disturbance and things like that, where you have a very fragmented sense of self. And yeah, and you struggle with relationships and trust and all of those things. And I realized that that was definitely my problem. And that was why I wasn't getting better, because I just wasn't getting the treatment that I needed. And my depression was kind of a byproduct of being traumatized, of having this complex PTSD. And so, because it took me so long to be properly diagnosed, I struggled a lot for a lot of years trying to get help, trying to be getting treatment, but it wasn't helping me the way that it should have been. Um, and so that was a really big moment for me, and a big turning point for me was actually getting correctly diagnosed, and going through more trauma specific treatment, which is very different from treatment for depression. And that's when I finally started to actually get better, see improvement. Because before I started writing my book and everything, I had been uh, like on disability for depression for, I want to say, 3 to 4 years, because I legitimately couldn't take care of myself at certain points and couldn't work and couldn't do anything. My symptoms were just too bad. Um, and writing was definitely part of, starting to write my book was definitely part of the way that I started to come back into myself and feel like a person again, after all of that.
So I have a question with that. So you said that your parents often told you, how you feel, how to behave, that kind of thing. And I imagine, that was something that you were very susceptible to when a child is like, if someone told you how you were, that was kind of what you took on as your identity.
Yep.
And becoming an adult and realizing that you had that fragmented identity, what things did you start to do to find who you truly were? Was it mainly through writing, or were there other things that you did to help uncover who you really were?
So writing was a big part of it, but I also kind of, it's funny, in retrospect, it's funny because I almost went through like a delayed period of adolescence, in my early 20s, where I was like, I don't know who I am. I'm going to try and figure it out. So I went through a phase where I was like, I dyed my hair like purple and like did all of those things that I should have been probably doing as a teenager, but I wasn't allowed. And I wasn't, allowed to be myself. I wasn't allowed to express myself openly. I was supposed to be a very certain way and fit into a very small box. And I just wasn't fitting into it. And that caused me a lot of angst. And then once I was an adult and I started getting appropriate treatment and everything, I was like, there's actually nothing wrong with this. Like, it's nothing I want to do is unsafe. Nothing I want to do is bad for me in any way. It's just I want to, say, dress how I want, dye my hair purple, um, you know, write just for the fun of it, read books, things like that, where I hadn't felt that kind of freedom before. And so yeah, it's funny because I did go through a period of a couple of years where I was just trying a lot of different things, trying to figure out what really suited me because I was free to finally do that. So
That's something too, like for parents, it can feel scary to let your kid express themselves and do things that are very dramatic, but in your situation is a great example. If you don't let them do that, it will just come out at another stage in their life, and allowing them to do that when they are still at home and have that safe comfort netting underneath them is probably the healthiest way to do it, as long as it's all, like you said, in the parameters of still being safe.
yeah, of course, yeah. And I think that's what is the difference, I suppose, between like boundaries and controlling, is that boundaries are there to keep us safe and to make sure that, we don't go overboard, nothing bad or catastrophic happens to us. But it passes into control when it's a thing that's not actually going to hurt anybody. Like dyeing your hair purple, nobody is hurt by that. Um, but it's more about appearances. I think it was for my mom and dad anyway. It was definitely about appearances and kind of their own self-image, because to them, their kids reflected them. Um, in basically every way. And that's part of why we were so restricted, is because they felt like we were almost their representatives in the world. Um, and I think that that is a very toxic belief, because the kids are ultimately going to be their own people one day, and they're going to be adults, and they're going to have a strong sense of identity, because this world is messed up as it is. So you have to have a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of who you are to be able to navigate it.
I like that. I like the urgency of like finding yourself. It's in, and especially, as we try to put stuff on our kids or we try to guide them, we have to be careful of like pushing them into something they're not. And that's a good thing to think about, is like to navigate this world, paying your bills, going to work, all that stuff's great too, but you can't lose yourself in the process. You do have to find yourself and hold on to
Yeah,
that. And it can change and it can evolve.
for sure.
Absolutely. Um, Emma, can you tell us a little bit about exploring this rediscovery of creativity, and then how has this contributed to that healing process more in a little bit detail? Like, was there a very specific thing that you latched onto that really was like, oh, this is helping me, this makes me feel good? Or
In terms of writing,
any sort of creativity, actually, because it could, yes, the writing, but also was there other avenues of creativity that also
yeah.
opened up other avenues of painting or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the writing was a big thing, and that was me sort of rediscovering my creative side, is when I started writing my book. Um, and there were other things too, a few other things that, one day and this was kind of during the same sort of period of like, I'm trying to rediscover or discover at all who I am and what I like. And one day I was like, you know what? I just feel like painting. And I had that initial, I guess, knee-jerk reaction of like, no, I shouldn't do that. Like, it'll make a mess. Because I mean, that was always a huge thing when I was growing up, like, can't make a mess. I was like, it's going to make a mess. It's going to be such a hassle. But I really want to try it because I've never tried it before, and I never had the chance to try it before. And I was like, but now I'm an adult and I can just walk into a craft store and buy paint. So that's actually what I did. I just went to a craft store, picked up a ton of paint, spent too much money on paint, and went home and just started painting little wood cutouts just for the fun of it, just because I could. And that was another point where I was like, I can do whatever I want now, and I can be whoever I want. And that definitely came out in my book as well, because the main character is she's put in a situation where she's kind of discovering that everything that she thought was true is not. And everything that she sort of attached to her identity is gone. Like, she's put into a situation where she doesn't know who she is anymore. And the main male character at one point says to her, one of the only perks of being out here in this post-apocalyptic wasteland is that now you can be whoever you want. There's nobody telling you that you can or can't be whatever way that you want. Because when she is initially at the beginning of the book, she's living in this, it's like a secure compound, and it's a very regimented way of life, very like totalitarian regime. You get told what to do all the time. You get told who you get to marry, whether you can have kids or not, when you can have kids, all of those sorts of things. Like, every aspect, her job, every aspect is tightly controlled and dictated to her at every point in her life. And then through a series of events, no spoilers, she ends up outside that community and out into this post-apocalyptic world where there's really no order. There's nobody telling you what to do. And every day is a fight for survival. But again, the one perk of that is that you can basically do what you want. And so she's discovering freedom and the double-edged sword of freedom, which is that freedom means you can do whatever you want, but when you can do whatever you want, that also means you can make bad decisions. Um, and so I definitely think some of that struggle is intertwined in the story. So that's definitely one way that it sort of came out.
So did you put your main character through situations that are like things that you kind of were trying to work through yourself, like situations, and it sounds very similar to things, but did you have her do like the outcome be something you wish you could have done?
Um, I mean, yes, there are definitely similarities between her struggles and my struggles. I mean, it wasn't an intentional thing for me at the time where I was like, okay, I'm going through this, and so I should make her go through this as well. It's more that it just came out that way, that I was feeling inspired by those things. And so it naturally came out in my writing. And in terms of, I also think that her finding herself in part through this relationship with this man that she meets kind of does mirror my own story as well, because definitely my husband was is always been my biggest supporter just in life and also in writing. And I met him at a really young age, and he's always kind of been a fixture in my life. And so definitely there is some of that in there, that he kind of helps her discover who she is, and um, kind of asks her the question for the first time, like, well, what do you want? Like, what do you actually want? Not like, what are you being told? Not, what your family wants, what your friends want. Like, what do you actually want? And gives her the possibility of actually getting it, which is both scary and amazing for her. And there's definitely some of that experience for me as well that came out in the book writing process.
That was something I was
Nice.
going to ask too, is like, did you feel a lot of fear around when, like you said, making the mess of the paint and stuff like that? Did you have a lot of fear around rediscovering yourself and like, exploring different avenues?
Yes, I mean, there's always fear in that, and I think that's part of the experience. It's not really discovery if you're not scared. Because the biggest fear for everyone in any situation is the fear of the unknown. Like, that looms over our lives constantly. So when you're kind of rediscovering or just discovering yourself, um, it's hard because sometimes you're afraid of what you're going to discover. So there's definitely that fear there, but it is just part of it. I think that you can't get the gains of discovering yourself without being scared of it first. It's kind of the price for self-discovery.
Very true. That's awesome. So your story is about a post-apocalyptic. It's a romance.
Yes.
What drew you to this genre, to this niche? Like, because it's pretty specific. So what drew you to that, and why are you writing that?
Well, it's interesting because, yeah, again, when I first started writing, I had no real intentions of anything. I was just kind of going at it. But it makes a lot of sense in retrospect because I always had a deep interest in post-apocalyptic fiction. And actually, when I was going to do my master's degree in English, I had to write like a thesis. And well, I never actually got to the point of writing it. When I was in the planning stages of doing the thesis, I wanted to write a thesis on post-apocalyptic fiction. And specifically, I was writing about sort of gendered fear in post-apocalyptic fiction, which is just, there's nothing more academic-ish than that. Yeah, just right. interested in the difference between the kind of post-apocalyptic fears that men have or male writers have, and the kind of post-apocalyptic fear that women or female writers have. Especially because there's such a big contrast between something like 1984 by George Orwell, for example, and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. In the case of 1984, it's about restricting autonomy and restricting thoughts. It's about restricting your freedom of thinking. Whereas with something like The Handmaid's Tale, it's very much about restricting like women's bodies and their reproductive freedom and the basically everything that makes them women and individuals. So I thought that was an interesting difference, and I was planning to study that and write a thesis about it. So I've always been interested in the idea of what would people be like after the end of the world. And in this very extreme situation, yeah, what would people be like? Would it bring out the best in people? Would it bring out the worst in people? And most of the time, it's a little bit of both.
Both, yeah.
And then in terms of the romance stuff, I've always been kind of interested in romance. I never really dove into romance books until I actually started writing my own book. And that was really for no specific reason. Other than that, I've been in academic circles for a bunch of years. And unfortunately, romance books are not heavily featured in any sort of academia, which personally I think is a missed opportunity, because there is so much that's worth studying and discussing when it comes to romance fiction. So when I started writing my book, I was like, I think this might be a romance, so I should probably read some actual romance books. And also because I'd always enjoyed romances in other types of fiction. And a lot of the time I was always like, okay, I wish there was more focus on the relationship between these people. So that's how I ended up reading them. And I ended up just devouring romance books for a while. I read something like 75 books in like a year and a half. I just plowed through a bunch of them, and it was super fun. No regrets.
So
That's
your book is
amazing.
it's pretty big for a romance book. Is it safe to say that it is also very heavily fantasy as well?
There is quite a bit of like sci-fi influence in it as well, because it's definitely a romance in the sense that the sort of core of the story is the relationship between these two people. However, there is also an overarching plot to the book and to the series, that is not directly related to the relationship, if that makes sense. Like it's basically a series about what happens to this couple when they get together and they're in this really unforgiving post-apocalyptic world, and how do they navigate these really difficult events together as a couple, and how does that affect their relationship and their relationship with other people as well, and can they basically make this romance between them work even though they're in a really difficult and extreme circumstance.
I like that you were drawn to post-apocalyptic too, because like especially with the way that you're describing your childhood and things that you've gone through, it's almost like you needed to explore what would happen if you completely destroyed like the foundation of what everything was built on and what would happen after the fact.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely some of that in there as well. Is just that, especially because I really started writing the book seriously during COVID. And at the beginning of COVID, then we really didn't know what was going to happen, and everything was very bleak at the time because we just really didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't really know how serious things were or how serious they could become over
Sure.
time. There really was no telling. We kind of heard vague reports of, people dying and, people getting sick. And We didn't really know how bad it could be. And so at the time, it was kind of like we're almost sort of living through a mini post-apocalyptic scenario here. And because, yeah, at the time we had no idea how things were going to work out. They could have
Streets are
gotten much worse.
empty. There's no toilet paper anywhere. Like, yeah, we were
Yeah,
mini
yeah,
post-apocalyptic.
man, the memes during that time were quality.
Yeah.
but but yeah, I mean, I think living through that time and at the time not knowing how anything was going to work out definitely influenced the story and the idea of okay, if everything does go really south, how are we going to rebuild? Because I think that's intrinsic to like post-apocalyptic fiction as well, is that it's almost like a story of where the setup is okay, the worst has happened. Like the worst has happened. How do we move forward now?
It's the end of somebody else's story. Like they had this really big, dramatic thing happen. That's the end of their story. Now this is the beginning of this story. How do we build from there?
Yeah, I mean, post apocalyptic fiction, I think, is ultimately about human resilience to some extent. That even when, the world has ended and maybe there aren't even that many people left, um, there is still hope.
Sure.
So with it being a really, really big book, the process of going through and editing it and, redoing all that, I feel like this might be a little bit of trauma for you just with how much, going through and working through and then realizing how much you have to work through.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the book when I initially wrote the very first draft was 275,000 words, which is about as long as Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
It's about as long as Game of Thrones. Um, and I was very overwhelmed at first because I was like, I know that this is too long, but I don't really know where to start in terms of cutting it down. Um, and so it was a long process of trying to cut it down. And eventually, a friend of mine who also like edited and beta read the book, eventually he was like, "You got to split this into two books because you have two problems. One is that it's too wordy. So like most beginner writers, it was definitely longer than it needed to be. But he was also like, but you also have the genuine problem of having too much story to fit into one book. And he made the point of like that's not necessarily a bad problem to have. It just means that you have to separate it into more books. So essentially, this first book is the first half of the story of my first draft. And of course, almost none of it stayed the same. But the basic outline of the story is basically that first half, and then trimmed down a little bit more um, to make one book. And then this second book, upcoming sequel, is kind of going to be the second part of of that massive draft that I once created. And what's funny is that I even had more books after that because I kind of went on a writing spree when I first started writing this book. And so I had 275,000 words. That took me maybe 3 months to write.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, so and then I immediately jumped into like the first draft of what at the time was going to be the second book. And I wrote that and cranked that out. And then I started on a third book for the series. And when all was said and done, and I finally got to the editing stage for the first one, I had three massive books, all for this series. I had written probably 700,000 words in about 10 months.
Wow.
And yeah, so I've never achieved that level again. That was my prolific phase. But yeah, so I have tons of material for the series and lots of ideas, nothing but ideas. But yeah, the editing process was definitely difficult for that reason because there's so many ideas and you just can't do them all necessarily. at least not for the same book. So yeah, I I will never run out of material is basically the conclusion of that.
That is impressive. I have to say, I thought I could relate to you for a minute, but then you kept getting grandiose and grandiose because like my first book I wrote, I had a similar problem where it was I got to the end of it and I was like, okay, wow, this is a lot of content. It actually makes sense to split it here and then divide it into two books. But then you just kept going, and it's like, no, I have to still write my next two books, and you've already got it all kind of
I
figured
can't
out.
really explain it other than that I had like discovered creativity again and writing again and I was just going with it. Like
That is beautiful.
at the time I actually remember my doctor because I was telling him about like, oh yeah, I'm really into writing and like this is how much I'm writing. And he was like, okay, so let's discuss mania and whether this is a manic state that you're going through. And thankfully, it was not that at all. I was just really excited and, yeah, really excited and really energized by this new idea and rediscovering creativity again. But yeah, I wrote a ton. I mean, at the time, like the initial writing took me like a year, like for the three books took me like a year. But keep in mind that the editing process was like at least twice as long as that. Like it was probably 2 years of edits and revisions. And the final book has almost nothing in common with the original draft in terms of the actual writing. Like everything is basically new content. It's really just plot points that I ended up still using, some of them, not all of them, but some of them. But in terms of the actual writing, it has basically nothing in common with the original draft, which is something that I think is good for writers to keep in mind because what you're seeing as a finished product often has very little in common with what it started out as.
We were actually talking about this the other day. Someone had brought up Kindle Vella, and I was like, that is a great platform. I love that people use that. But what readers are going to be so surprised by, I feel like, especially if authors are using that as a close representation of their first draft, the book that they will likely publish after that is going to look completely different than what they're consuming on Kindle Vella.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because it changes so much.
It changes so much throughout the editing and revision process, especially when especially when you have an editor that is not afraid to be critical. And I mean that in the best of ways. Uh,
You need it. Sometimes we really, really need it.
Sometimes we just need it when someone comes to you and just says, this is genuinely not a good idea. You need to rework this. And that definitely happened for me. And it was positive for me at the time because it helped me figure out, okay, what is working that I'm doing and what isn't, and um, why? Like, why is it working? Why isn't it working? And also kind of shows the difference when someone's reading it versus writing it, because I think when you're writing it, because you're the author, you already have all the answers. So you already know everything about your story. And so while you're writing it, you put a lot of intention into it and you think that your intentions come across because you think that they're self-evident because they're self-evident to you. But then when someone actually reads it and interprets what you've written in a completely different way that you had no idea was coming across, it's it's difficult and really interesting sometimes what people can get out of your writing. And it helps you kind of hone the craft a little bit of like, okay, how do I actually produce this effect that in my head is there,
Yeah.
but is not actually appearing on the page?
It's funny that you said that because I had a scene in my book that I'm working on now, and I had my husband read it, and it was this character that's very kind of withdrawn, and she doesn't really want to share her background story, but she gives like a little tidbit, and like I know her whole background, and so whenever he read it, I was like just watching his reaction. I was like, oh my God, he's gonna freak out when he reads this because she's just you get to realize that she's not just a dick. She had stuff happen to her, and then when he read it, he had no reaction or anything, and I was like, well, what did you think? Why? And he's like, I don't know. I thought that that was a small piece of her background. I was like, but she had so much more. And he's like, I didn't
Yeah.
get that. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh.
Yeah. Yeah. It's because it's so obvious to you. So it's like, how could you not be getting this?
Yeah.
With one of my characters, it was like it's the main male character. He was supposed to be really like smart and capable, and um, you know, his sister was supposed to kind of poke fun at him and everything, but it was okay because like he's competent and awesome. And then as I gave it to my one of my friends to read it, he was like, it's like, why are they so mean to him? He's so like incompetent. So it doesn't even, it just makes him look sad. I'm like, oh, okay. Because to me, I was like, it's obvious that he's so great and so awesome. But then on the page there, it just wasn't coming across at all. But it was obvious to me, so clearly it must be obvious to everyone. So that was definitely one of the major things that I got out of the editing process is like things that are obvious to you as a writer are not obvious to the reader unless you make them so. Um, and yeah, that was definitely one of them.
That is hilarious. That is so funny. As a reader, does that kind of surprise you at all, Kathy, on like how we have like these characters and then the background story that you don't get, but then you realize is there for you?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. But I can imagine it because sometimes and even, probably like characters that come across so assholes, like you're like, I don't like this person at all. In y'all's mind, there was like all this other stuff and it all makes sense to you, but then as a reader, it's like, no, I don't like that person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's challenging too is learning the difference between, okay, this person just has a different interpretation of the text, and it might be a legitimate interpretation, but you're not actually misleading them. Like it's possible to interpret it the way that you've put it down, um, but a person might have just interpreted it in a different way through their own lens, or they may just have interpreted it the same way as you and just not like it, which is
Sure.
valid. But the difference between that and I'm actually not communicating correctly. I'm actually not communicating what I'm trying to say here. It's not coming across clearly. And the interpretation that I have in my head is not actually possible based on what I've written. So it's hard because it feels like splitting hairs sometimes because people can have such different interpretations of the same work, the same text, and that's kind of what makes things interesting. But at the same time, you have to make sure that whatever you have in your head as your intention is actually possible to interpret.
Yeah.
And like you said, like having outside perspective is huge. Like just having a couple people and kind of similar to how you were saying it could be interpreted differently. So having multiple people read through it and be like, okay, this is what I took from it, or this is, how I saw it. And then was that my intention? That's huge. The feedback from beta readers and, editors is just you can't publish a book without having those people. A good one, at least I think.
For sure, yeah, yeah, and it's definitely super important to have multiple people go through it. I definitely did. Had multiple rounds of beta readers. Had a friend of mine that was editing it, and I still work with editing my second one, um, and who he's also a writer, so that helps a lot. Um, but yeah, I think in general for new writers, I think it comes across really intimidating because it's like, okay, you have to hire an editor and spend thousands of dollars on this manuscript. And I honestly think that that frightens people away. I know it would for me, and it almost did at the time because it's just so overwhelming and it's a huge cost. But I would say to those new writers that you don't have to hire an editor for thousands of dollars for your very first book. In fact, you probably shouldn't. Having multiple rounds of beta readers, I mean, that's what I did for my first book. And it's true that I do have like a background in copywriting and editing, so that definitely gave me a leg up in that regard, um, and my kind of educational background as well. But those are all things that can be learned. And yeah, there's plenty of people online who will beta read your book for free or for very low cost. And so I guess my little message here is don't be intimidated by the idea that you have to spend thousands of dollars on a manuscript that you may not even be sure of yet, because I think that's too scary for a lot of people.
Yeah. No, I actually have like my first romance book that I wrote. I was very confident in it. I loved the story, and then I sent it to the editor, and she did, the best she could with what she had, and I got it back, and like I just was consuming it again myself years after I had written it, and I was like, I actually don't want this published. I'm going to unpublish it. I'm going to rewrite it. And I completely reworked the whole thing. And I'm like, I spent money on the editor when the story was not ready to be out there. Like it needed revised. And now the story that is the final product looks nothing like what I spent money on to have edited in the beginning.
Yep, yep.
And there's also groups on Facebook for sure that I mean, it's specifically for ARC readers, beta readers, street teams. Like there's groups that you can join that have those people that want to do that.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great community, especially if you find the right people that you connect with. It can be a little overwhelming whenever you post something out and you're like, do the blurb of it, and then no one wants to read it. But then you just have to like, okay, no one wanted to read that. So now I need to adjust that because that's not interesting to people. That is actually feedback in itself of like, okay, well, that's not pulling anyone in. So let me adjust this and rework on it and then try again.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it can be intimidating when you send your book to a bunch of different beta readers and they all come back with different things. But I think for the first time writer, the thing that you have to look at is the commonalities between what they say. Because sometimes it's true, people interpret things differently and they like things and don't like things that are totally subjective. But I think one of the points of pride for me with my own first book is that when people don't like something in it, it's a legitimate choice that I actually made and not something that I accidentally did without meaning to. It's an actual writing decision that I made that for whatever reason they just do not like. And that's okay with me. If people don't like the deliberate choices that you're making, that's a good sign rather than them being like, I didn't really understand this. This didn't really come across. I'm not really sure, and I'm not really sure how I feel about this, because if someone is not sure how they feel about it, it often means that the book needs something.
That's a good point.
That I love that. So, I mean, kind of to pull all that together is, like if you're going through hard situations and you're going through tough times and you turn it into art, like beautiful things can come from very dark places. And it just because at the moment you feel like it's not good enough to go out there or, you're scared to put it out there, keep working at it. And sometimes, especially with, painting specifically, like that could just be the finished product, right? Because like it is very emotional, but with words and things, a lot of times our emotions are so high that the logic that goes behind it isn't quite there. But I still so many stories that I have talked to people about the story behind that story of like why they wrote that is very dark. But the story is beautiful and there's this beautiful conclusion and the character goes through this huge transformation, but it came from a place of very bad hurt for the author a lot of times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And even when you look at like classic works of literature, that's often the case is that those famous writers channel their darkness, I guess, into creating this work of literature that everyone loves. Yeah, I definitely think that's the case.
I love that your motivation is really driven by your love of writing and reading and books and stories, like the whole process of learning and continuing to improve. And I love that. Is that really like what is your motivation? Like, is there something specific in there that
Well, I've always loved to learn just in general. That's actually one of my favorite things about my day job with copywriting, because a lot of the time what I end up having to do is research. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of that when they think, oh, copywriting, that's just like writing ads, which it is to some extent, but there's also this piece of a lot of the time I have to do research on the background of this industry and where is this company situated in this industry and what do people like about this industry? What do people not like about it?
Right.
And sort of create content around that. Because a lot of the time, what I end up doing is long form content. So blogs, articles about different products, or articles about just the industry that they're in, etc. So I end up doing a lot of research around that, and that's one of the best parts of the job for sure, is getting to learn about all these different industries and all these different just little parts of the world that I may have never discovered otherwise or had any idea that I might be interested in.
Sure.
And that's true of writing books as well, because I ended up having to do quite a bit of research. And, my Google searches are sometimes very scary, my search history, because I ended up having to do a lot of research on survival kind of stuff, because, it's in a post-apocalyptic world. And how do people survive outdoors? And what
Right.
happens when, someone gets sick and there's no medical treatment for them? What kind of progress would that disease take, or what kind of things could someone do if they didn't have access to medical supplies in a hospital,
Right.
to make reactions and descriptions realistic? And yeah, my Google searches they're super interesting. I remember Googling once of something like, what what would it feel like to be shot? Because I want to describe it in a way that feels real, but it makes me look like a serial killer.
There should be a
Ooh, okay,
caveat.
so
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was I'm sorry. So doing that research, did that make you in your personal life be like, ooh, I maybe need to like have some of these things on hand in case the world goes to shit?
I've definitely thought about it, but I haven't created my own bunker yet. um, but yeah, I mean, it definitely does make you wonder about like, what would I do if things did go badly, and what would my plan be, if anything? And yeah, all those kinds of things. And it also makes you realize just how far we've come as a society, as human beings, because in that kind of situation, the smallest little thing that goes wrong can be totally catastrophic. Like
Sure.
a simple cut on your hand, if it gets infected, that can literally kill you if you have no medical care, no supplies, nothing like
Yeah.
that. Um, it's so easy for things to go south when you don't have any of the modern conveniences and the things that we've come to rely on. And so it was definitely getting into a totally different mindset when writing about those things, because and it's a challenge when researching too, because for example, I was researching hypothermia and what would happen if a person fell through ice and got really wet and started to get hypothermia. What would you do, and what would be the stages, like what do you do after someone falls through the ice? And what's challenging about researching that is that, of course, the top kind of reliable sources are always like, call 911, get to the hospital, which is good advice, but not applicable in my situation.
Not helpful.
So, yeah, so it's a lot of trying to figure out, yeah, what does happen when there's no 911 that you can call? And in those situations, what would your characters do, basically, to try and deal with this situation when they don't have access to anything?
That's funny. It is so, and that brings up something that I just thought of, like, a lot of phones, there's a lot of charging for phones that have, solar power to them. But and now that I just thought of that, if the world was to end, you wouldn't have internet. I was thinking like if they were to search something, how frustrated those characters would be when it says call 911. But that none of that is even, oh my gosh, I can already see the trouble that you go through.
Yes, yeah, and that really is the trouble, is that there is no internet. There is no source of information other than what they already know. And what's been taught to them through their lives. They're literally just working with the resources they have on hand at the time. And there's no help. There's no help coming. And it's a terrifying scenario to imagine, quite honestly. And hopefully that comes across because every time I try and put myself in those situations, the number one thing is just fear. Like that, you know, because we rely so much on each other now. And overall, I think that's a good thing. But if we're in a situation where we don't have access to that kind of help, we don't have access to experts and specialists who can tell us what to do in those situations, you just have to work with what you've got.
That's huge. I love that. And that in sort of a way too, that applies to us, nowadays, but it's very more advanced, right? Like if we have situations that we are struggling with and we're having a hard time going through, like just use the resources that are available to you and continue to work at it. And, that difficult situation a lot of times can be the most rewarding thing in your life. And it's especially with like comparing to writing or comparing to, self-discovery. A lot of that is very uncomfortable whenever you're trying to make it into something better. And it's very hard to sit in that uncomfortable feeling. You want to get out of it, but you have to realize that that is part of the process. And if you escape from the editing or if you escape from the self-discovery where it is the uncomfortable feelings, you're not going to reach that beautiful end product. And for anyone out there who's going through any tough situation and it's uncomfortable and it's hard, just know that's part of the process. All of us who have any sort of growth have experienced that, whether it be editing, writing. I love that I can compare those two of like also, self-discovery and self-growth. It's uncomfortable, it sucks, but just you got to push through it.
Yeah, the discomfort is part of it. It's just part of it, and it's impossible to separate it from that process. It's just, yeah, it's just part of it. So it's about, there's no around, there's just through. You just go through it, and you just have to have faith that there is another side to all of this, and you will eventually make it there.
Definitely. So, okay, I want to lighten it up just a little bit. I want to hear about the story of your quiz in the 6th grade.
Yeah. So that was a story just to kind of, I remember filling it out at the time and was just like, this is the silliest story to share, but it's kind of an illustration of what I was like as a kid, I guess, is that when I was a kid, I was such a goody goody. Like, oh my goodness, I was very much a rule follower and I never got in trouble at school and all of that. And I never even thought about misbehaving really, other than this time I remember in 6th grade. And even at that age, my like perfectionistic drive was strong. And I think that's part of why I was such a goody goody, is that I'm such a perfectionist, even as a young kid. And so there was this quiz that we were doing when I was in 6th grade, and I couldn't remember the answers to one of the questions, and I kept trying to remember and failing. And I ended up looking at my friend's paper at the time and copying her work, which I knew was correct because she was a good student. And I remember handing it in and just feeling so ashamed of myself afterwards. I never actually got caught, but I also never did it again because I was just so ashamed afterwards, and such a goody goody, and that continued. That just continued after that. That was my one tiny rebellion as a kid. Um, but yeah, it definitely reflects that perfectionistic streak that I sometimes still struggle with, to be honest. I always want to do everything right, whatever that means in any given situation.
I laughed so hard when I saw that because I was I have a very similar story. When I was in first grade, I cheated on a quiz and I felt so guilty, and I grew up in a very small town.
Yeah.
And I felt so guilty that I had my mom call my teacher and I told her. I was like, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry, I cheated on the test. And I'm in first grade, right?
So funny. I love it. Yeah.
Whatever. And ended up retaking the test. But yeah, I just laughed because I thought I understand that.
Yeah.
It was funny too, because when me and Kathy were talking about that, she's like, I even remember the teacher's name, and it's been all these years, and I can still remember what her name was.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny
Yep.
how things like that stick in your brain forever. Like, same with me. I just remember this random time when I didn't even copy the entire quiz. It was just one question. Um, I even remember what the question was. It was about the phases of the moon.
Wow. I don't remember that. I don't remember what mine was about.
No, I just remember that because it was just so burned in my brain, just the shame of having done it. So I guess that was my punishment was being incredibly ashamed of it afterwards.
I
That's
love that
hilarious.
question though. I love realizing that we're human. Like, right? Sometimes we feel like
Yeah,
we're almost in this just like routine mode. We just wake up, go to work, do the same thing, and we forget that we're human too. And like, so that question is very like, like you said, these things stick in our brain that affect us emotionally or affect us in any sort of way. And all of us have those little stories where it's like, think of something that embarrassed you throughout your life, and everyone can like immediately go to something that was like very pivotal to them emotionally.
yeah, yeah,
So this is your debut novel, your first thing you've ever published, and it
yep.
has already released. So it's been, like you said, what, a month or so?
Almost a month. Yeah.
Almost a month. Are you done with like your ARCs? You've kind of got all that finished. So now people
Yep.
are just leaving reviews from your book, correct? Like go read the
Yep.
view or read the book and then review it.
Yep.
Nice.
So I sent out a ton of ARCs. I basically gave them out like candy because it was my first book, and I was like, no one cares about this, so I'm just going to send it to as many people as will take it. And I do think that that strategy paid off. So uh, I had a bunch of reviews at launch, which was exciting. And yeah, it's accumulated a bunch of reviews since then as well, which has also been really exciting.
Amazing.
Now I'm curious, just because me as an author, I'm curious on what platform you used for your ARCs. Did you have a specific one, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so I tried a bunch of different ones, just just to kind of get a lay of the land, figure out what I was doing, and figure out what really worked and what really didn't, because I'd sort of heard mixed things about all of them. So I definitely went with BookFunnel, which was probably the most successful, I would say. And that, I mean, BookFunnel is not explicitly an ARC service, but it definitely helped in terms of like building an email newsletter. That was hands down the best investment for sure, was using BookFunnel to build an email newsletter. Um, and then in terms of ARC specific services, I tried what I saw as the three most popular ones that I saw mentioned. So I tried Booksprout, I tried Book Sirens, and I tried Hidden Gems. Um, and to mediocre success with most of them, to be honest. I think that the only one that I actually thought was worth it was Book Sirens. That was the one I definitely had the most success with. And most of the people that picked up my book actually reviewed it. Um, the next would have been Booksprout, and that was okay. I I wouldn't do it again, just because most of the people that picked up my book did not read it or review it. There was a couple, but most of them didn't. And then Hidden Gems, that one, unfortunately, wasn't worth it for me at all. I think I got one review, and it wasn't even clear that the person had necessarily read the book. So that was unfortunate because Hidden Gems is also the most costly out of those three. And I had over 20 people sign up for the book, and only one person reviewed, and it was not a high quality review. So that was really a disappointment because I was really hoping that it was going to be great, especially because it cost the most by far, actually, by quite a lot. But yeah, Book Sirens is the only one that I would use again. So I guess that's my recommendation. I do think that these things vary depending on genre as well, that certain genres are more popular on certain platforms. Like I know Book Sirens is very big for romance. And so that may have been a factor that helped me. But I've also heard people say that Booksprout is good for romance, and I didn't have as much success with that one. So I guess those are my tiny mini reviews of those services.
Oh, that's great.
I've never even heard of Hidden Gems, and I've never even heard of it.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening to, ARC stands for Advanced Reader Copy. So it's a process that authors go through to try to get reviews that can post to their book as soon as they publish, or just in general.
Yes, yeah. And basically with those services that I mentioned, how they work is you aren't paying for reviews. You never pay for reviews. It's against Amazon's terms of service. It's very bad. Never pay for reviews. But you're not actually paying for reviews. You pay the website hosting these reviewers to post your book on their site, and then reviewers can sign up to get your book and then hopefully review it. So that's where the cost factor comes in. Also, I found Book Sirens pricing to be the most transparent of the three, and most reasonably priced, I would say. So yeah, overall, I think it's worth it to maybe choose one of them to do. I just tried the three main ones that I had heard of, just to kind of figure out which one I liked the best and which got the best results.
I feel like that plays into
I got my answer.
Yeah, I was excited. I feel like that plays into your marketing. Like you are very marketing mindset. Like, so you need to get all the information from every single one that's out there.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to marketing, like the most important part of marketing by far is market research and just learning about your customers, who else is in the industry, what are they doing, what do people like about them, what do people not like about them, etc. So all of that is super important. And I would say definitely the most important part of the marketing process is just figuring all of that out, figuring out who your readers are, where they hang out, and what they like, what they don't like, etc.
That's fair. Now, you've got your next book is expected to release this winter. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep, we have our fingers crossed that I'm going to make that deadline. But yes, the overall plan is to release it sometime this winter, maybe like December, January-ish. Don't quote me there, things can change. But yeah, hoping that the second one in that series is going to come out then. I also have some side projects that I'm working on that will hopefully see the light of day. So yeah.
Like that. Now, so just to kind of go back just a little bit, we kind of talked about things that influenced you on your writing with your life, but what other like books and authors and stories that you consumed influenced you?
Right. So, well, my favorite book, maybe of all time, is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. For a lot of reasons.
The second time I've heard that book mentioned this week.
It's a good book and so unlike the film adaptations, so unlike them. I think I've never seen a book that's had so many film adaptations and none of them are an actual representation of the book in any way, shape, or form. And I don't just mean like this is a bad interpretation of this book. I mean, there's literally nothing in common for a lot of these um, film adaptations because the original novel of Frankenstein is kind of this thoughtful, gothic music about the nature of humanity and the hubris of humanity in trying to create life. And it's about like a very flawed character because of course it centers around Frankenstein, which is actually the doctor and not the monster. um, the doctor who creates the monster. It's mostly actually about him and not about the monster. It's mostly about him and his sort of character journey towards kind of this. It's about his hubris and the fact that he tries to create life arrogantly without considering any of the potential consequences or ramifications of doing so. And then once he creates life, he doesn't know what to do. And so it's all about that. And then it's about kind of the revenge of this monster that he's created. And it's interesting because you feel, despite the fact that the monster is supposed to be not quite human, he's very human. Like at his core, he feels so much loneliness and despair over the fact that he's the only one of his kind. And yeah, it's about all of that. And the movie adaptations, while I'm not denying that they might be very entertaining, they are mostly like classic kind of campy monster movies, which is fun, but not at all like the original novel. And a lot of people, like I said, are under the impression that Frankenstein is the monster, but it's actually not. It's actually about this doctor, this very, very flawed doctor. And so one of the things that I love about that book is that it really is the very first true science fiction novel. And it was written by a 19-year-old young woman, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I had no idea that she had written that. And honestly, I don't think I even realized that there was a book. I think I knew that there was talkings about a book, but I did not realize that there is an actual book. I, like most of the world, probably have thought that, it was the original Frankenstein movie that came out in black and white. And
Yeah, with like Boris Karloff and all of that. And
yeah.
like that's definitely what is famous and cemented in people's minds. And yes, it's definitely takes inspiration from the novel in terms of it's this doctor that, brings this monster to life and then he terrorizes the world. It takes inspiration, but the tone and the spirit of it is very, very different. And so, yeah, that's probably my favorite one. And it makes sense because it is really the first real science fiction novel, which has had a big influence on me. I also love like a ton of different authors, but one of the books that was really formative for me growing up was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And that is a book that delves into the nitty gritty of mental illness, basically. And given everything that I've talked about here today, that definitely spoke to me at the time. And she has such a vivid way of describing emotion. Like there's that famous passage in The Bell Jar that's about the fig tree. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the basic concept of it is life is like a fig tree branching out above you, and each fig is a choice that you can make, but choosing one means losing all the rest. And that really spoke to me when I was growing up as a teenager, and it speaks to me now as well, is that making a choice often means losing all the other choices that you could have made. And the book is in part about that, about it's about mental illness, but it's also about growing up and becoming a person that exists outside of the place that you grew up, your family, all of that. It's about individuation, um, and the struggle of that. And it's semi-autobiographical because Plath, she struggled with mental illness a lot during her life, and her journals have been published and everything, and they're beautiful too. And it's really obvious that she struggled with all of that, and it's obvious in the bell jar as well that it's semi-autobiographical, because I think it would be hard to write a book that delved that deeply into sort of this dark pit of despair without ever having been down there yourself.
That's fair. And that's something I think a lot of people don't realize is whenever they're reading a book that is very, when you get a lot of emotions, it's typically because it's close to the heart of the author.
Yeah.
What did you say her first name was? I wanted to take a note on that.
Emma.
The author's first name is?
Sylvia.
Sylvia
Plath.
Plath. Sorry, I thought you were asking me my first name.
That would be so rude at this point.
Yeah, no, it's Sylvia Plath.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, because that's definitely something I'd be interested in reading myself. So I wanted to make sure I got that. Now, you said also that music was heavily influential on your writing as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, music has always been a huge influence for me. And as a teenager, music was really sort of pivotal for me in expressing myself, for sure. And that was one of the few ways that I felt like I was able to express myself as a teenager, was through music and the bands and artists that I liked and all of that stuff. So, yeah, I always listen to music, almost always, while I'm writing, depending on the mood of the scene, the mood of the characters. It really helps me to visualize things. And a lot of the time when I'm trying to come up with ideas, I listen to music because I I see things when I listen to music and listen to songs. I often see like stories in my, like almost like a little movie in my head. I can see things happening based on the emotions that the music makes me feel. And that's kind of how I end up writing a lot of the time, is through music evoking those emotions.
Now, is it mainly like instrumental, or are you able to listen to words while you write?
I can listen to words while I write. I have to, because I
That
do like
is
instrumental
a
music
skill.
too. Yeah, I do listen to instrumental music too, for sure. I love like movie scores and stuff like that. But I definitely also love music with lyrics, because the lyrics are often what make me actually feel things as well, is this other artist's words. Uh, Especially because a lot of the time lyrics are not so explicit about what they're about necessarily. It's just expressing, it's almost like emotion in its purest form. It's just expressing emotion and doesn't necessarily have anything attached to that. Which is great for writing, because then you can sort of interpret it however you want. You can pick up on the feeling that this song gives you and create your own interpretation of that emotion, or channel that emotion into whatever scene that you're writing. And for me, I like my music on the dramatic side. I really love listening to, ever since I was a teenager, I really love listening to symphonic metal, which, just like my genre of books, is an interesting fusion of two genres that don't seem like they should go together. It's like a fusion of sort of classical music and heavy metal music together. And yeah, first blush, it doesn't seem like they should go together, but then you hear it and you're like, this makes complete sense.
That's
And
fair.
hopefully people have that same feeling when they read my book.
That's fair. I personally, if I am listening to lyrics when I'm writing, that ends up in my story. Like I'll end up typing a word that I just heard, or so that is a skill that I wish I had, because there's so many great songs that do pull emotions that I would love to listen to, but I will find the instrumental version of them and just listen to that.
Yeah, that's a good kind of compromise. For me, a lot of the time what I end up doing is um I'll listen to like the same song on repeat and just keep having that song playing as I'm writing because a lot of the time I'm kind of tuning out parts of it anyway because I'm working. So it helps because it's repetitive and so not necessarily attention grabbing, but it still kind of gives you the emotion of the song.
Yep. No, that's good. I commend you for it. I could not do it. My brain would I would have lyrics through all throughout my writings. So I wanted to touch really quickly. This is just something that I thought was really fun that you shared that you own too much makeup.
Yeah, it's very true. I I love makeup. I've always loved makeup, and I guess it's another form of like expression for me. I love being able to kind of change looks and play with color. And yeah, I mean, it's basically painting, it's just your face. So I really enjoy that. And so, yeah, I have an impressive, we'll say impressive collection of makeup that I use and that I love owning.
I subscribe to like it's the, like the makeup delivery service that you go and you pick out whatever. Have you ever heard of that?
Like a subscription box or
Yeah. Where you go and you can pick like if you want like facial care, like moisturizers and toners and stuff like that, or
yeah,
makeup.
I have done subscription boxes before. I think it kind of reinforced my bad habits with buying though. So I eventually stopped. Um, but and now I try and because I have such a large collection, I try and sort of moderate how much new stuff I bring in these days, try and use up what I've got. Um, but yeah, I've definitely done that before and it's a lot of fun.
It is, yeah.
Now, so to kind of wrap everything up, like with not really like the conversation in total, but like your journey through stuff, as we go through things, teaching it to somebody else is very like it's almost like wrapping up our growth process, right? So you have daughters, you have kids. What does that look like for you as you are like kind of re putting back into the world what you have got out of it?
Um, well, I don't actually have kids.
Oh,
Um,
I'm so sorry. I
that's
have
okay.
that on my notes.
Totally okay. But no, I don't actually have kids. But I, in terms of putting it back out in the world, I think part of it is definitely like putting my work out there and just letting it stand on its own and being able to sit with the fact that my work is not going to be for everyone. And that is fine. That's okay. Not everyone has to like what I put out there. Not everyone has to love me. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have to change anything, which is a big deal for me because I think in the past I always felt like, oh, if someone doesn't like me, that means there's something wrong with me and I have to change that thing rather than if someone doesn't like me, maybe that's something to do with them, their own preferences or something going on with them. And someone not liking me is not necessarily a reason that I have to change that thing that they don't like. It could just be that we're just not compatible for some reason. And that's the same with a book as well, that someone reads it and doesn't like it. It might be that they were looking for something else. They had different expectations. They were having a bad day. Who knows? It could be any number of things, but basically it's not my problem.
That's huge.
And
I love that.
not kind of taking it on as like a personal thing where it's like, oh, if this person doesn't like it, that must mean it's bad. That must mean that I have to do something differently because that's not necessarily the case. It's difficult sometimes because you have to differentiate between like constructive criticism that might be useful in helping to make you a better writer or make you a better person versus a difference of opinion. someone doesn't like this, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It just means that for whatever reason, it wasn't for them.
I love that you said that too, because like something that I try to, teach and talk about is that other people's opinions of you are none of your business. Like that's their opinion of you. And I love that you said that you don't take that on to where you don't feel the need to change yourself because of someone else's opinion of you. And that's huge. That's something that's very hard for a lot of people to do. But I think that if everyone did practice that to some degree, it would change a lot in their lives.
Yeah, agree.
For sure. And I'm not meaning to say that I'm like perfect at that. I
Yeah, it's hard.
definitely have times when I, have read like a negative review and been down on myself and been like, oh my goodness, like this is an awful review. They hate my book. It must be because my book is terrible, etc. I've definitely had those moments and I'm sure we'll have them in the future. But it's not about not having those moments. It's just like not letting those moments take over your whole life and try and be for everyone, because you just can't be. You can't please everyone. You won't please everyone. And when you try and please everyone, ironically, the one person you don't please is yourself.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of follow your own path there.
Yeah. The worst thing that could happen is people could like you for something that's not really you. Like that is the worst possible thing that could happen, because then you have like this feeling that you have to be this person that you're not. And that's not you.
Yeah, for sure.
So where, if listeners want to connect with you to purchase your book, or maybe even get on your email list, anything like that, how do they contact you? How do they connect with you?
So they can go to my website, which is esluckauthor.com. Pretty simple. It has all my information there. You can find my social medias on there. You can sign up for my email list to get occasional updates. And I also send out free books sometimes. So yay for that. Everyone likes free books.
Yes.
I am on Facebook and Instagram. I'm most active on Instagram. Facebook is kind of a mixed bag in my experience. I mean, yeah, Facebook is a mixed bag because I find that people often just do not see any of what I post there. I remember Facebook congratulated me once for getting 2 views on a reel, which felt more like an insult than a congratulations. But definitely Instagram is where to find me if you want to follow me on social media. Other than that, everything else, where to buy my books, all of that is on my website.
Awesome. All right. Well, I thank you so much, Emma, for being on. See, I know your name.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, this is a great conversation. I love your journey. I love that it started off, as this place that you struggled with, and now you're just this beautiful, confident, like I've written this book, I'm telling this story, this is who I am. I love the transformation, and I love that we got to explore that with you.
Yes.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, guys.
To talk to you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Hey guys, thanks for joining us on this episode of Lemon's Listening Library. Remember, every story has a journey, and every journey deserves to be heard. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep listening.